All right. Even though some of you are still eating, let's just give a round of applause for the catering staff here. What a tremendous lunch. I thought my age was finally getting me to a spot where I got to eat first, but then they told me I had to do the introduction for this next panel, so I'm not as elderish as I like to think I am sometimes. First of all, I'd like to, conferences like this don't come together without sponsors. I'd like to thank all the sponsors who helped contribute to make BC IROC a success, both over the years and today. But I'd like to introduce the head table that we brought together. My good friend, director from C3 Alliance, Dan Jepson. My new partner, and I should say my favorite chief executive officer of Western Forest Products, Mr. Stephen Hofer. This is still a weird one. Someone who worked for me for so many years, I consider him like a nephew type brother. I can't boss him around anymore because he's one of the 4 people who signed my paycheck, but Chief Chris Roberts from We Become Nation. Dr. Deb Saucier from Vancouver Island University, great discussion this morning. I look forward to, over the years as we've gotten to interact and we've carried this discussion further and further, and I just hope more people join us on that journey, and thanks for being here, Dr. Deb Saucier. I'd just like to thank Elder Sandra from Snuneymuxw Nation for joining us today. I see that she's stepped out of the room for a minute, but again, it's not proper to do these things without the respect and welcoming of the local nation, and Snuneymuxw Nation has always been here for BC IROC, and that's one of the reasons why everybody feels at home is because we've been truly welcomed by their community. So, round of applause for the Snuneymuxw Nation. Jordan Point, he's a man, he keeps telling me he's retiring, but I run into him more and more at more FNFC conferences and other things. But I'd like to thank Jordan Point for coming across and being part of the panel and always being a stalwart voice on First Nations fisheries. Our head table, ladies and gentlemen. So we got a treat today. Again, as we talked about with BC IROC, is we really want to get the Indigenous focus on where these discussions go. We know it's collaborative. We know there's multiple groups, governments involved, but we really want to get that focus on how First Nations have taken a place where we weren't really welcome to a point where we're driving the agenda, and we have different capacities in place to help other nations continue to achieve their goals. So it's a great honor to introduce Bill Lomax, the CEO of the First Nations Bank of Canada, to come up and share some words with us. I'll let him introduce himself, but I just found out that him and Corey went to law school together at UBC, and I believe you're Gitxsan, I believe. So welcome to BC IROC, and we look forward to your words.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you're not trying to go to sleep like I am right now. As was mentioned, I'm Bill Lomax. I'm President and CEO of First Nations Bank of Canada. I am also Gitxsan from Northern BC, a member of the House of Luce, and really happy to be with you today. Just to give you a little bit of my background, as was mentioned, I went to law school at UBC. I did undergrad in law school there. I'd moved down to Vancouver with my mother as a teenager. So I got started here. I worked for the BC Treaty Commission for a couple of years, and I figured out very quickly that I didn't want to be a lawyer for the rest of my life. And part of the draw for me to move out of this space was that the Treaty Commission, this is back in '97, our job, or the whole idea behind it, was to get all these First Nations through the treaty process. I thought, oh yeah, that's gonna rock and roll. I mean, we can see how many have gotten through so far, right? It turned out to be not as quick as I thought it would be. But one of the things that I saw when I was there very clearly was that there was a really good leadership across the province and really good lawyers coming along. As was mentioned, my friend Corey here was in school with me. And it seemed like there was a lot of young people going into law school at the time. What I didn't see was anybody in the finance world, certainly not in the investment world. And so I thought, I think I want to do something a little bit different. And so I took a bit of a left turn and moved down to the States. Ended up going to business school, doing an MBA at Columbia University in New York. And from there, worked on Wall Street for the next 20 years, working with tribes, building mini sovereign wealth funds, basically tribal sovereign wealth funds. And that was really a great experience. I learned a lot while I was there. But I always wanted to come home. And I didn't think I was going to get an opportunity to, partly because I had this really amazing job with Goldman Sachs. And I didn't know what I could do here that would be better. It was the best job I ever had, until now. And now I am running the First Nations Bank of Canada. And for those of you that don't know First Nations Bank of Canada, it's been around for 27 years. It started off as a concept in somebody's living room in Saskatchewan, and they decided that the banks were just not serving First Nations the way they wanted them to, and they thought they would build a bank. And honestly, if you told me that back then, I would have said it's a terrible idea. In fact, if you tell me it now, you want to start a bank, I'm going to tell you it's a terrible idea. But it worked out. They were the little engine that could, and here we are, and the bank has done very well. We have about $1.3 billion in assets, and we lend about $600 million to First Nations and Inuit communities across the country. And we're doing really well. We have about $4 billion in trust assets, and we are really, in a large way, a reflection of the communities that we serve. So we're in a place where we are ready to grow, and that is exactly what we're doing. And part of that is being here with all of you. So we are based in Saskatoon, but I actually live in Vancouver, and BC is one of the areas that we'll focus on very heavily. So enough about the bank for the moment. I should just say a couple other things. We're 87% Indigenous owned. 70% of our staff is Indigenous, as is over half of our board and our senior management team. So very much focused on that. Let me talk a little bit, I'll pivot a little bit into what I really want to talk to you about today, which is the economic transformation that we are seeing within Native communities right now. The shift has the potential to dramatically improve the overall well-being of nations across the country. And there's so much for us to do. We need strong economic and political leadership, and we really need it now. And honestly, what all of you do in this room is going to have a major impact on how we move forward. So how do we get there? If we look back about 30 years ago, when a number of us in this room were just getting started in our career or thinking about starting our career, things were very different, right? You didn't have billion-dollar projects that First Nations were involved in. You didn't have $100 million projects that First Nations are involved in. But look around you now, and it's a very different situation, right? We had dire poverty back then. Really, we didn't have a lot of that much support from governments. There was some, it was starting to build, but we really weren't there yet. There wasn't necessarily a lot of corporate interest in engaging with First Nations. And so it's just a very different time. The wage gap for Indigenous people at that time was really not good. It was about 66%, Indigenous person would make about 66% of what a non-Indigenous person would make. So what's changed? We're 30 years later. Things are a lot brighter. The wage gap has changed. Now it's more in the 84 to 89% range. So there's still definitely work to do, but it's trending in the right direction, right? Economic development is in a whole new category. It basically didn't exist that much 30 years ago, and now we have 48% of nations have some kind of economic development program going on within their communities. We have 38 Indigenous communities that have a $10 million or more investment trust. That's about to explode exponentially. We have the Robinson-Huron settlement, for example, $10 billion. We have Cows and Plows, $23 billion. And that's just the stuff that's outside of BC. Let's see what happens out here, right? There's just so much going on. Official reporting from the feds right now says we need about $76 billion to satisfy the needs in the short term for settlements, for legal settlements. It's so much money that all the bureaucrats are starting to get really antsy and upset, getting passive aggressive about it. They're saying things like, if it weren't for these Indians, we'd have a balanced budget. So we're seeing, things going the right way for us. It's really a good time. We're starting to see good things happen, like federal government stepping in and doing the new Indigenous loan program, which we've been heavily involved in, is going to do so many amazing things for us on the resource front. We have actually a partnership with the bank and the Canada Infrastructure Bank, where we secured $100 million from them. We will loan out $100 million in matching funds, and it will be the lowest cost capital that you can get in the country for any kind of land development that you might do that requires infrastructure. So there's a lot of great things going on. So what are the commonalities that we see with First Nations right now? So we're seeing potential or actual large financial settlements. It's a big thing. We're starting to see return of land in a big way, right? I mean, who would have thought that the government would start wanting to divest some of the greatest land that they stole from us, right? Government and corporate entities really have a desire for procurement. That's a big change, right? I mean, it was embarrassingly bad here in Canada up until about a year or so ago with the federal government. Now they want to do 5%. I mean, it was basically a 0.5% or less up until that time, right? Economic development experience, we still got a ways to go here, but it's certainly a lot better than it was 30 years ago within our nations. The main problem it's really the main problem that we have is that we are coming into opportunities now. So many of us are coming into opportunities now that we don't have enough people in the space to help us tackle all these problems. And so we have to figure that out. Sorry, let me just find my right spot here. So what do we do? When we think about that, let's take a look sort of around and see other groups that have had a situation that might look a little similar to us. And when I look down at the States, I love talking about the casinos because there's just so much money, but that's not our situation. It's a really different animal. If we want to look at what is interesting, we should look actually more sideways over to Alaska, because the Alaska Native corporations have a lot of similarities to where we're at right now. Alaska Native corporations were established in 1971. I'm going to give you just a little history lesson on that. And the government, in order to settle land claims, transferred 45 million acres of land to the corporations and provided about $962 million in financial compensation. That was real money back in 1971, right? And so, in the 1970s, they had if we look at kind of that situation, they had a very small number of Alaska Natives with university degrees, and even a smaller number with corporate experience. So they're actually behind where we are right now. But we could spend all day talking about Alaska, and I don't want to do that. What I do want you to think about is kind of their situation in that they had these corporations that had a responsibility to provide income for their people, right? And they were owned by the Indigenous people in Alaska. But they didn't have this experience. And so what happened was during the 70s to the 90s, they made a lot of bad decisions. That $962 million didn't go anywhere near as far as it could have. And a lot of these corporations ended up declaring bankruptcy. They made comebacks, but it took a lot of work to get back from a very bad situation. And what changed for them was the way they approached business. The first thing they started, or what they did do in those 1970s and 1990s that worked well, was they started sending all their young people to school. And so you'd see a number of folks going to some of the biggest schools in the US, Harvard, Stanford, Yale, mostly Stanford because it's an easy flight from Alaska, but there was a lot of people going to really great schools, a lot more educated natives up there. And they also started to hire very talented non-natives to come up and work with them. So around about the 2000s, things started to turn around for them. And if we take a look at one of the case studies, one of the groups there was called Bering Straits Native Association. And Bering Straits, they were one of the ones that went bankrupt. Around about 1989, they went bankrupt, and they had to get started again. First year after bankruptcy, they only had about $1.4 million worth of revenue from all of their corporations, or sorry, $1.8 million back in 1989. But then they started getting into procurement. And again, we talked about that. Now there's an opportunity in Canada to participate in procurement in a way you hadn't before. They really got into procurement, and it took a while. They got their first contract back in 1993. And then by 2003, they'd gone from that $1.8 million to about $14 million in revenue. Big change, still not a lot of money for the thousands of people that they were serving. But they kept going, and by 2008, that $14 million had turned to $151 million in revenue. And then they hired a woman by the name of Gail Schubert, and she was a member of Bering Straits, but she had gone to Stanford. She'd worked on Wall Street as a lawyer. She'd worked at the Federal Reserve. She had a fantastic resume, so they hired somebody really great to run this program for them. And she went gangbusters with it. They ended up, when she retired a couple of years ago, at $500 million of annual revenue. And the amount of difference that can make for a community is really astounding. And now anybody who's a member wants to go to school can go to school basically anywhere they want, and they'll have funding through their programs there. It creates way more jobs than they can actually manage. And they have jobs all over the country. So it's not just in Alaska. They actually have lots of businesses down in the lower 48. So what do? We're not exactly in the same situation, but we can learn something from this. And really, I think the big lessons are around how we build capacity within our nations. That's really critical. We've got to get the people, young people, into doing the work with us that we're not seeing them do now. You know, banking, I know all of you think it's sexy, but the average 17-year-old, not so much, right? And accounting, I mean, there's probably dozens of accountants in here for all I know. And, you know, everybody loves the accountants, right? Not the 17-year-olds. So, you know, we got to find a way to make these things more interesting to them, right? We don't have Glee. We can't, you know, schools, there's not great television programs about accountants and bankers, right? It's Wolf of Wall Street, and I don't even know what the accountant show is. But it's not easy to get young people into doing this kind of thing, and we really need to do that. Let's come back to building investments. So part of what we need to do is build a good investment strategy. Most of you in this room are going to have to figure something out on that front if you're not already. There's really a couple of different ways that you can have a business. You can go through organic growth, which basically you build it from the ground up. It's slow. It has a lot of risks to it, but it can make a lot of sense in certain situations. And then there's acquisition. And acquisition is kind of, as the name suggests, you go out and buy something, and then you bring it back, and you indigenize it, and you find a way to make it work for you. Whichever way you go, you want to start thinking about what's my advantage here? What's the competitive advantage to doing something like this, right? You know, people talk about all the time, I want a level playing field. Baloney. Nobody wants a level playing field. You want to be the guy up here, where the playing field looks like that. Otherwise, you have no competitive advantage and you don't make any money, right? That's just the way it is. So if we want to figure out what's your competitive advantage, any Status Indians in the room? Status Indians? We got any Status Indians? What's your competitive advantage, my friends? Right? Who's asked you that lately? Well, you have a bunch of them. Right? We got a bunch of them, and let's talk a little bit about those. So, let's, you know, if we think about what is your advantage, what is it you can really do? What is it you get? What's the bump you get for being a Status Indian? Get your minds out of the gutter. I'm not talking about pregnancy. I know you're going there. But what is it that is actually an advantage of the Status Indian? Didn't necessarily used to be one, but there is now. We have, for example, we have some spending power, right? We've got some bougie natives in this room. I can see them right now. Look around this room. Everybody's looking and trying to buy that fur in the back. We got some bougie natives, so we've got spending power now, and that really has changed things, right? We have a tax advantage, yeah, and that plays out in a couple of different ways, right? As an organization, as a bank, we love the urban reserve. We love that because there's just so many advantages around that, right? Everybody starts off at the gas station. How many people drive 15 minutes just to save a couple of bucks on gas, right? Indians will travel to save money on tax, for sure, right? That's just the way it is. So you take a look. I work at the Black Tower at Squamish Land in Park Royal. I buy everything in Park Royal because I want to save that 12%. I walk through there, and there's we're all kind of high-fiving. There's Indians walking by me every way. They're over at Best Buy, the bougie women. They're over at Anthropology. They're all there spending their money, right? And that actually makes a significant difference in what you can make, right, for your business. The other advantage is the income advantage, the tax-free status that you can get if you're working on reserve, right? We are a Schedule I bank. We pay people well. We don't pay our Indian folks anything less than our non-natives or other folks that aren't status Indians. But what that does for us is that allows us to keep people that are highly talented and are native. We've got Jed over here. He's never going to leave us because he has to go make 40 to 60% more working someplace else, right? And that's true for all of our status employees. And so it's really a big advantage for you when you think about it. And coming back to the status Indian bump, we have the population. We have more young people under 25 than any other community. And what is every business missing right now? What is everybody struggling for? They're looking for employees, right? So we've got the population. We've got all these advantages that other communities don't have. So we need to take advantage of that. But this is something that you need to really think about as employers and as people who have their own money to procure things, right? So I often see it that we see folks that don't necessarily want to hire Indian, or they don't want to buy Indian, they don't want to support the company because they're worried that they're not going to do as well as the white guy. So I want you to listen really carefully. Have I got your attention? There is nothing magical about a white man. Okay? They're not smarter than us. There aren't more geniuses. They don't know our community as well. I told my friends over here I was going to say something offensive, but really, seriously, some of our folks have better education than the white guy that's going to show up. Buy native. It's how we're going to advance as a community, right? It really is critical to what we do. So now that I've said the offensive bit, I don't know how quickly that's going on TikTok, but I'm gonna head to work closing here. I want you to think about a few things. Our young people do need more corporate experience, and corporate Canada and us, we all owe it to try and bring young people in, right, and get them jobs in banking, get them jobs in accounting. Get them jobs in finance, because that's the future. That is your future. The only way you're going to be successful is if you have young people who are doing that. We can only do so much. You all have a responsibility to push them that way. Stop sending them to be teachers and lawyers. I mean, no offense to the lawyers, and kind of offense to the lawyers in the room, but I was a lawyer once too, right? So I get it. But the problem, honestly, with lawyers is two things. One is that they're some of the only role models that young people have. And that's a great thing. We do need them. But we need the young people to have more role models who are in my industry, right? The other thing is, I think there's a lot of lawyers out there that don't necessarily always want to be lawyers for the rest of their life, and we need to find a way to laterally shift them. find a way for them to be able to still pay their mortgage, still pay for their, all the things they need to raise their family, and move into corporate Canada in a position that could be management. So I think those things are really important. And this is all really important to nation building. So I'm going to ask you, what role are you going to play in this? Are you going to play it safe and be able to tell everybody you were conservative, you made sure that you didn't lose any money, and that you made sure that you only hired and only bought the things that were the cheapest for the nation? Or are you going to be somebody who says, I empowered my people. I hired people who were Native. I gave people a chance who were Native. What do you want to leave behind when you retire, when you're moving on and passing the torch to somebody else? Think about that. So I'd like you to do two things for me. First, bet on yourselves. Build businesses that are going to bring jobs to your communities and really help to build up your communities, because jobs in your communities, that's how we bring our people back to our communities. It's how we stop the brain drain. It's a really important part of nation building. It's the jobs part of it. And the second related thing is bet on Native people. Hire Indigenous people both in your business and as outside professionals. There's no shortage of Native lawyers, as I like to tease, and there are a lot more Indigenous financial professionals than there have been in the past. And by the way, if you need a bank, we're right here. Thank you.
Another round of applause for Bill. I thought I could offend people with charm, but obviously I got some work to do. So tremendous to be able to have this kind of discussion. I think, for a long time we all thought we had to be on the outside and look in and try fit in a certain way. But I think the leadership initiative of different organizations like yourself just show us that if we build it, they will come. And I really want to thank you for being here today. Now, without any further ado, I'm not going to tease you because I'm afraid of like 4 people in my life, and you're 1.5 of them because of your grandmother. But Corey Wilson's going to lead us through a nice moderation and discussion with Bill. So without any further ado, Corey Wilson and Bill Lomax.
Hello? Oh, there we go. It's working. Great. Thank you. I'm the lucky one that gets to do this. I promised that I wouldn't reveal any law school stories, but thank you for that speech. I think it's also very refreshing. I am one of those that when somebody brings up finance and do you want to be on the finance committee, I roll my eyes and say, no, please, any committee but finance. But I think all of your points are absolutely incredibly important, and we're at the Indigenous Opportunities Resource Forum. And everybody in this room is working really hard to ensure that Indigenous people have opportunities and that nations have opportunities and that it's full inclusion. And later on there'll be a panel on equity, diversity, and inclusion and the ESG and whatnot. And you mentioned the partnership, the participation agreement that you have with the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, the matching funds for $100 million. What are some of the, how could you see that, for 2 things. What are some of the projects that you think you'll see coming through? And what could be applicable, because I know you're also trying to expand to British Columbia, could be applicable to people in the room?
Working all right? Okay, good. Yeah, so this is really a great program. We're the only bank in Canada that has this agreement with Canada Infrastructure Bank. And it really applies if you're, the easiest situation is if you're developing new land. It's actually called the First Nations Indian Land Development Program. And it can be on reserve, it can be off reserve, but your nation has to own or control the land in order for it to work. And what happens is you might have, for example, let's say you have a hotel that costs $20 million, and if $5 million of that is infrastructure costs, such as laying down the foundation, all the pipes, the servicing, the road to make it there,
if that costs $5 million, Canada Infrastructure Bank, through us, will loan you that piece for an incredibly low price, very close to 1%, for 25 years. And then our portion will be at sort of normal bank rates, competitive bank rates. So right now, if you think about a $20 million loan, let's say if 15 million of that was at 5%, and the rest was at 1%, that's a substantial overall savings for you.
Great. I think one of the questions that actually just came up goes along with that is when you're looking at potential investments, what are some of the keys to avoid in order to not be seen as too risky?
Oh boy. Well, having some folks with experience doing what you're doing, that's really helpful. Sometimes you may have to go outside to do that. So if you're, again, coming back to the hotel example, if you've never run a hotel before and you just think you're going to build it and it'll be fine, you'll advertise on the internet, that's probably not where people want to see. You might want to have a partner that has experience in the hotel business to get you up and running. So experience is absolutely an issue. Over leveraging, having too much debt, and not having some money to put into the deal, that can often be a problem. It just depends on, very much deal dependent, but because we do, in certain cases, on some of, it doesn't apply for this program, but in some of the clean energy programs right now, we're seeing those financed at close to 100%, if not 100%.
That's good to know. There's been talk as well about moving away. You mentioned gas stations. That's a typical entrance into owning a company, owning a business, owning a corporation for many First Nations. Have you seen examples in Canada, or I guess probably more in the United States, of where we see Indigenous nations work together or have some kind of shared model where it's distributed prosperity and it's not just, because of course in British Columbia we have 204 First Nations. If every First Nation here, let's just say, created a gas station, well that's a problem, right? When we could leverage and do some of these projects that we see. So have you seen examples, or could you give people advice on how to work with others to advance economically?
Sure. I think there's some, if we go back to the hotel example, that's a fairly obvious one, and you can extrapolate from there. But if you think of communities in the north or more remote communities that don't necessarily have a lot of opportunity to build in their territory, they might want to come together and put a hotel in their most likely gathering place, their town, where they go for medical services and things like that. Because if they all go in as investors into the hotel, and then when they send people down for medical services, and those people, some of them will need to stay in a hotel, then you have a few different nations coming together and sending them down to that hotel, and that just makes that hotel, again, much more successful. I've seen a number of tribes in the States get together on things, but they tended to be bigger deals. Hospitality is one of them. There's some that have definitely come together and built hotels, not in that same situation, but they've done it because they were sending people to Washington, D.C. all the time. And that hotel has gone gangbusters. Could you also do it in any number of other areas? Absolutely, right? I mean, you can think of a sawmill that services multiple territories. Think of any number of other situations like that.
Great. And so one of the questions goes along exactly with that is, what are financial management institutions doing to help close that gap? Because as we know, some nations have resources, some nations don't. We have that whole spectrum of nations, which also goes to not only financial and location, but also in terms of capacity and size. Yeah.
That's never an easy issue, but we're seeing more solutions to it now than we ever have, right? If there's a good opportunity in our realm, something that we think is a good business that somebody wants to move forward with, there's actually a fair amount of competition. People talk about there not being enough capital. Oftentimes, if there's not capital for the deal, it's because the deal stinks. quite honestly. So you have to be careful if you really can't get financing for something that's sort of should otherwise or is otherwise being financed, then you have to look at the thing that you're trying to finance. Now, there may be ways to make that deal not stink anymore, right? And it might be that the only reason that it's not great is because the interest rate just doesn't pencil out with what you're trying to do. And with some of the loan guarantee programs that are coming along now, they can help lower the interest rate pretty significantly. And in those cases, all of a sudden the banks will be much more interested in the situation. But I would encourage you to be very careful and make sure that you really think that this business opportunity is going to go well. That doesn't mean you don't take some risks and you don't try, but don't do it just because there's a loan guarantee. The risk with that is, and I've seen this happen, is that the embarrassment that comes with a financial failure extends to your whole community. It extends to how you're perceived in the community. Same way when you have a really good business, it extends to your whole community. And that's really what we're looking for, because it creates a sense of pride. And people, both internal and people outside, they might be a bit jealous, but you're kind of like, yeah, you should be, right? That's what you kind of want to see.
Great. I know one of the things, you're almost 1 year on your job. You started May of last year, right? So you're almost 1 year. And I know one of the things that you were really keen on bringing and expanding is the wealth management services for First Nations. How is that? How are you seeing it?
That is going to be a massive area of growth for us, certainly. So I grew up in the industry down in the States, building sovereign wealth funds for tribes down there. And we absolutely need that here now. And the big banks, well, you know, they're out there doing it to some extent, but they're selling you their own products, and there's problems with that. I can argue about that at another time, but whether or not we go into it, there is absolutely a need for wealth management services within the community. These big settlements that we have coming in are going to create very large pools of capital. And you have to figure out how to manage the risk in those pools of capital when you have them invested in stocks and bonds, but also still be able to use them to create economic opportunities for the nation, and of course do other good things for the nation when we come to nation building.
Great. So one of the questions here is about First Nations' holistic approach to economic development. You would think that by extension, having more Indigenous people in finance, we're going to increase that area and have more influence in that way. But the challenge, of course, as you mentioned, is getting First Nations people, Indigenous people involved in finance. How do we close that capacity gap? How do we, as you said, excite that 17-year-old to become an accountant when it's not as flash as another career?
Well, we can't all be influencers. I mean, you're doing a great job of it, I have to say. But we have to find a way to reach them at a younger age, and that's and I kind of touched on it. But there's really an obligation for us as corporate citizens in this country to pull people in. And all of you have an obligation to kind of push them in to this area. I think I've had meetings with a lot of my colleagues at the other big banks, and we're starting a conversation now about how do we come together and create a bigger pool. If we have a bigger pool of young people going into this space, that means we have more people to hire, and it's good for us that way. It's also good for us and for the communities when they go back to the communities with these skills. If our clients are educated around managing their investments, that's very good for us from a banking perspective. And so we really need to just find ways to cycle them through our banks, but also the accounting firms. I think trying to find a good native accountant right now is one of the hardest things to do out there, a good native CFO.
So we're getting to the end. We are at the end, actually. But what is the one thing that you're most excited about for this next year?
just the massive amount of growth that we're going to see at the bank. If you're interested in talking to us, we are going to be growing substantially here in BC. We're growing our capital investor base. If you're interested in joining, you'll learn a lot about, we have a lot to tell you about what we can do in your territory. And yeah, it's going to be a great year. Thank you.
And I know there was another question about small businesses. One thing I do know about the bank is very open to any level, any size, any kind of conversation, from individual all the way to big capital projects. So thank you, Bill. Thanks for that. Keep up the good work. And we look forward to your second year ahead of the bank.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. What a great discussion about boring accounting and finance. You know, I'm thinking there might be a niche spot there. We could get some kind of CBC show going or an APTN show on the funds of finance. First Nations. There you go. There we go. Thank you. So, Chief Chris Roberts presented you a couple gifts on our behalf. We'd like to do our photo op and then ask people to go take at least 50 steps outside, because I'm going to be on this damn mic all afternoon. You're going to listen to every bloody word I say. So go stretch your legs, check your messages. The people are going to clear the room from lunch, and we'll come back in 20 minutes. Kayla Kesla.